Hello, it's Cried here with my Storm Samurai build, which is an extremely powerful build that allows you to choose one of the two possible stat paths in order to better suit your own playstyle. As you've probably guessed from the name of the build, the Storm Samurai uses Storm weapon arts. To be specific, although not the only weapon art used in this build, the main star of the show is Stormcaller, alongside the newest Great Katana. This is a powerful weapon art that can be casted for 3 times in succession, with each stage of the weapon art granting you 150 hyper armor. This refreshing hyper armor allows this melee ranged Ash of War with its fairly extended duration to work quite well even on bosses. Now, Stormcaller is a very rare weapon art type that uses the win art calculation. I'll simplify all the complications in this video and directly tell you the damage, but I'm going to link my weapon arts calculation guide in the description of this video. If you're interested in learning about the nuanced weapon art calculation, do check it out. Long story short, even though this is a quality weapon art, putting our Great Katana on Keen Infusion would yield the highest damage. There is something to keep in mind though. The status MV of Stormcaller is actually fairly high. This means that increasing our base bleed with the Occult Infusion is a great idea, especially because we're not losing too much damage compared to the Keen Infusion thanks to the weapon hit portion of the Ash. For a bit of damage loss, we are able to deal 96.4% more bleed with the Occult Infusion. Even if we include Bloodflame Blade on the Keen Infusion, we're going to be getting 610 bleed buildup over the course of the entire Stormcaller. On the other hand, Occult Infusion will deal 648 bleed buildup, which is still 6.2% more without the need to buff up. So if you really hate buffs, this is the stat distribution for the Arcane Path that I suggest. Because without any buffs, I would say that an Occult Infused Great Katana with Stormcaller easily beats the Keen Infused version. Now, the strength and dexterity for this build are set below the requirements of the Great Katana because of the helmet I'm using for this build. The Divine Beast Helm not only increases the damage of your storm attacks by 4%, it also increases your strength and dexterity by 3 each. Because it provides such a strong buff, this helmet reduces your focus by 45 and also decreases the regeneration of your HP pots by 9%. The Divine Beast head actually gives an even stronger effect at the cost of an even bigger deficit, but I'm not about to wear a helmet bigger than my body. The rest of the armor are for fashion and reaching the 51 poise breakpoint for PvE. While the arcane version of this build works great and makes do with no buffs at all, the dexterity version is definitely stronger and more flexible as it adds something else besides buffs to your toolkit. First up, we are investing 25 points into Faith, which you can do on the Arcane build as well, although not as easily. We save points with the Dexterity build since we're running the Keen Infusion, and the Dexterity requirement is 18. 25 Faith grants you access to the typical buffing spells like Golden Vow and a Greater Barrier or Flame Grants Me Strength. It also allows you to use Bloodflame Blade on your Great Katana for the additional bleed buildup. This allows the already strong Stormcaller to become absolutely amazing. The best seal at this Faith level is the Finger Seal, but the damage portion of Bloodflame Blade doesn't really matter that much, so feel free to use something else. Now, why else do I recommend the Dexterity build? We're stacking the Divine Beast Helm's bonus of increased storm damage alongside the Shard of Alexander and the Enraged Divine Beast Talisman. We're committing hard to using the Stormcaller Ash of War, but this does not mean that we can't use another weapon art that also happens to be a Storm one. On the offhand, I am running a Serpent God's Curve Sword, which restores HP when an enemy dies. This works even if you want to two-hand your Great Katana, but I usually keep my Great Katana one-handed for easy access to either of my weapon arts, depending on the situation. On my main hand, I have Stormcaller, and two-handing my offhand grants me access to my secondary Ash of War of choice, the Stormblade. Stormblade gives this build a ranged option to clear some enemies first for safety, or to quickly finish off weaker enemies. Since the range portion of Stormblade is a bullet art, the base attack of the weapon does not matter, and we want to have our Serpent God's Curve Sword on Keen Infusion to maximize its damage. I know some of you are in a hurry to point out that there is also a melee portion of Stormblade. That is indeed true, but its melee portion's damage percent is weaker than even light attacks, and does not provide any hyper armor, so it is not nearly as suited as Stormcaller at melee range. You can simply swap over to spamming Stormcaller with this build, as it also has quite a good poise damage buildup in addition to better status buildup. I've read some comments suggesting Stormblade on the Great Katana, which definitely works great, the same reason why Stormcaller works great with the Great Katana. However, Stormblade doesn't perform as well as Stormcaller at melee range, especially against enemies that don't flinch from Stormblade. This is why I don't mind just tagging Stormblade on a weaker weapon whose passive I desire, as I swap over to Stormcaller when the enemy gets within melee range. Therefore, the melee portion of Stormblade doesn't matter for me. One more thing to note about Stormblade is that you can chain multiple casts of this weapon art in relatively quick succession, with the largest delay coming from the first cast. This is because it has a fast recovery window for chaining into itself, so when you're using this weapon art, you usually cast it more than once. Now, the Serpent God's Curve Sword synergizes really well with our build, because you have to remember that the helmet of this build reduces your HP pot's potency. However, it does not reduce the health recovery effect of Serpent God's Curve Sword. So while exploring, you can load up a bit more FP pots, as you can spam the Stormblade for safe kills on easier targets, and the Stormcaller for more difficult elites. This way, you don't really run into any trouble with the reduced flask healing, thanks to the Serpent God's passive. As for bosses, the Stormcaller makes short work of bosses with its incredible damage. It is FP efficient enough, you can just bring more HP flasks for bosses. They're going to be running out of HP before you're running out of FP. If you really want to be thematic, you can obviously run something like the Uchi Katana instead, or a second Great Katana if you have one. Even Stormwing Arrow with a bow works for a ranged option, but nobody likes to farm these arrows. At least, I know I don't. Okay, with the ashes and stats covered, why am I picking the Great Katana for this build? Doing a quick filtering for 20 strength and 80 dexterity for the weapon classes that can cast Stormcaller. The two best options are the Great Katana and the Flamberge, because they come with the additional base bleed. And remember, Stormcaller builds up quite a bit of status effect, and the Great Katana comes out on top in terms of the attack and weight, without losing out on anything. Plus, the Great Katana moveset is great. For the talismans, we have our trusty Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman for PvE, followed by the Shard of Alexander and the Enraged Divine Beast, which buffs the potency of storm attacks by 10%. Since we're going to be spamming a lot of weapon art with this build, and both of them are storm based, these two talismans are great. I'm running Lord of Blood's Exaltation for my final talisman slot, which gives a big 20% bonus when you get an enemy to bleed. Not all bosses bleed though, and the Stormcaller does still count as consecutive attacks, so here are some talisman replacements for Lord of Blood's Exaltation. For the Physick, the Thorny Crack tier can maximize our damage, while the Opaline Heart tier is just a solid pick. I don't usually run into stamina issues with Stormcaller, but Stormblade has quite the high stamina cost. If you feel like you're having stamina issues because you need to range spam a boss down, I also suggest trying out the Green Burst Crystal tier. Like and subscribe for more weapon breakdowns or optimized builds like this one. If you want to support my work, please consider buying my fantasy novel or donating to my Patreon down below. With the book purchase, you can also request a topic from me. Krite, signing out.